Okay, I think we've just gone live. So, welcome everybody to today's panel discussion on life at the margins and inclusive discourses, an inclusive discourse on the lived experiences of LGBTQIA plus individuals. So, my name is Navya. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'll be facilitating the conversation today. And just before we introduce the panelists, I'll hand over to Dr. Ananya to briefly talk about TherapHeal.
Hi. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the panel discussion today, which is so relevant. So before starting off, I would warmly welcome all the panelists, and I'll talk briefly about TherapHeal. So TherapHeal is a global online platform. We have a team of clinical psychologists licensed from different parts of the world, and we are here to provide competent, ethical, queer, affirmative, and compassionate mental health services. One of our values is inclusivity, and that is why we are engaging in working towards LGBTQ affirmative work to the entire month of March, and we will be continuing throughout. Today's panel discussion is just one part of our initiative towards inclusivity. I'm so glad that you have joined in. For anyone who is seeking mental health services, kindly visit our website, www.therapheal.in, to know more about us. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Ananya. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Padmaja, who's going to introduce the four panelists that we have with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Navya. Hope I am audible to everyone. And I'd just like to introduce myself. I am also a clinical psychologist, and I'm working with Dr. Navya and Dr. Ananya on this campaign. And I would like to first thank all of you and a warm welcome to all our panelists today, and also to our audience, for taking out the time today despite your busy schedules. And we believe through this campaign that and the panel discussion that we are able to move towards and beyond, inclusivity and safe space for everyone. So I would like to first start with introducing Dr. Tirthankar. So Dr. Tirthankar Guha Thakurta is a doctor and also teaching faculty at Department of Physiology at KPC Medical College and Hospital, Jadavpur. He has completed his medical degree from Kolkata National Medical College and Hospital. His areas of work include mental health, gender and sexual rights. He's also a filmmaker and a queer rights activist. He has been very proactive in demedicalizing homosexuality and also voicing out against wrong media portrayals of the community as well. Dr. Thakurta also delivers talks, conducts workshops and seminars across Bengal, and often with doctors to bring more awareness about the gay and lesbian community. A list of the films directed by him are Lal Chatar Golpo, Magic, Being Positive, Strangers in the Rain, and Piku Bhalo Ache. We welcome you, Dr. Tirthankar, to today's panel discussion.
Thank you.
We move forward to Dr. Anita Rao. She's an associate professor at Christ University, Bangalore, India. She teaches students in educational psychology and teacher education programs. She has trained early career faculty. Dr. Mysore has previously held positions as a senior faculty at Indus Training and Research Institute in Bangalore, and as an assistant professor, teacher education department at University of Wisconsin, USA. She started her career as a research assistant in cultural psychology, working out of Mysuru for research projects of Yale University and University of Michigan. Dr. Mysore's PhD in curriculum and instruction with a specialization in multicultural education is from University of Arkansas, USA. She also prepares her students and educators for culturally and linguistically inclusive settings with an objective of achieving educational equity. Dr. Mysore also serves as a reviewer for the journal Action in Teacher Education. She's interested in studying educators and professionals in allied fields who practice inclusion and equity in their spheres of influence. A forthcoming book with Lexington Books is titled Narratives of South Asian and South Asian American Social Justice Educators. Welcome, ma'am, to today's panel discussion. So moving on, so Dr. Vandina Shetty, she's a psychiatrist and rehabilitation specialist with 8 years of experience. She's a consultant psychiatrist in Nirvikalpa, the Mind Body Center. She took up specialist training in psychiatry, including DPM from JJM Medical College and Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Services in 2015, and her MRC Psych from UK in 2021. She underwent additional training to earn a fellowship in psychiatric rehabilitation from NIMHANS in 2017. She's also a member of the Indian Psychiatric Society, International Society for Sexual Medicine, and a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, UK. Apart from being a clinical expert in medical management of psychiatric illnesses, she also practices an eclectic style of psychotherapy based on clients' needs. She believes strongly in promoting overall mental health well-being and normalizing the dialogue around mental health. She has a special interest in sexual medicine and believes there is a dearth of female specialists working in this area. Her other areas of interest include addiction psychiatry, adolescent psychiatry, rehabilitation in chronic mental illnesses, and promotion of workspace mental health. She also advocates for sexual and reproductive health rights among the LGBTQIA plus population. We welcome you, Dr. Vandana.
Thank you so much.
We also have with us Ms. Sumabha Mandopadhyay, and she is a doctoral student and university junior research fellow at the West Bengal National University for Juridical Sciences, Kolkata, where she was formerly associated as a research assistant at the Center for Regulatory Studies, Governance and Public Policy. She's also pursuing active research and activism on transgender law and their rights. She pursued her LLB, BLLB from School of Law, KIIT University, Bhubaneswar. And she has also pursued her LLM on human rights from National Law School of India University in Bangalore. Recently, she has also been awarded the Indo-Canadian Shastri Scholarship to pursue research on victimization of transgender person and also preparing to undertake the comparative research soon. She has many publications also under her name. She's presently pursuing a research on glyphosate and rights of nature in collaboration with Earth Tribe, United Kingdom, and another one with West Bengal National University for Juridical Sciences, Kolkata, on transgender trauma and stigma. She is also a governance facilitator for GAN Youth Hub, Ecuador, and World Youth for Climate Justice, and is passionately working on rights of nature. She also serves in the advisory boards of various organizations. A dancer lawyer, she's also one of the founders of Unmute, an independent online legal resource platform for safeguarding the rights of the artists in India. In the series, Shilpa Kala Ebom Ain, rights of LGBTQIA plus artists were also covered. So welcome, Ms. Sumabha, to our panel discussion today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So we all look forward to an enriching and thought-provoking discussion today. So I'd hand it over to Dr. Navya to carry forward the panel.
Okay, thank you so much. So we've got about an hour today. We've got 50 minutes left. So you'll have to excuse me for being the one that's going to try and keep us on time. We'll have a question that I'm going to ask each panelist, and perhaps a bit of a conversation with each panelist in turn. And then towards the end, we'll hopefully have about 10 minutes for a Q&A for any of our audience who might want to ask questions, or if anything has come up during the conversation that we can all talk about together. So I'm going to state the question. So the first question is, from the perspective of your profession, how can our systems be more supportive of the queer community? And I'll go to Dr. Tirthankar first. Can't seem to hear you. I think you might be muted.
Yeah. So is the question directed to me?
Yes, yeah. So from the perspective of your profession, I guess the medical profession, how can our systems be made to be more supportive for the queer community?
Well, if we talk about the medical profession and the way it views the entire queer spectrum, we have to actually understand the current scenario and why the scenario is like this. Now, in a nutshell, the medical profession in general, both in academics as well as in clinical practice, is quite alienated to the whole concept of a queer lifestyle. Most of the books that we read, the kind of texts that we teach, the curriculum in general is a heterosexist and heteronormative curriculum. So say, I'll just give a simple example. Like when you are discussing the various systems of the body, be it in the chapters of physiology or pathology or medicine or surgery, you have a reproductive system, but you don't have a sexual system. So the whole focus of the sexuality is on a heteronormative, heterosexual, procreative sex, and that too pinovaginal. And that is where the whole concentration of the sexuality of medical education comes. There are also biases at various levels as to misgendering people, not understanding the gender diversity. For example, you will often see teachers, in an attempt to be more polite, will teach their students that you never address someone with their first name. You always say like Miss Sinha or Mr. Gohatakutta has a problem. But they never ask us whether we should ask what kind of pronoun they prefer. So you impose the pronoun based on their presumed biological sex, and then that becomes an act of humility that is appreciated. So this kind of presumption culture is quite rampant in the whole medical curriculum. There are subjects like the forensic medicines which teach redundant theories on sexuality, from the crime of lesbianism to the scene of Sodom and Gomorrah being translated into the then section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. And even after reading it down, the books have not changed much. And even if the books have changed, the mindset is very difficult to change. Now, it's very important to understand why the medical community is so ignorant about the queer life. You have to understand that what you are seeing today in a senior professional will date back to an academic practice that happened 20 years back. So the professional who is practicing today must have done their graduation and post-graduation maybe 15 to 20 years back. So that is a reflection of the kind of academics, the kind of academic politics that was going on in the campus during that period of time. If we are talking of the period when in India, 377 was not read down. People might always say that why are we always relating the social stigma with a single law? How many people were prosecuted under 377? But if you analyze and understand, you see the stigma or the overall impact of a law or a penal code is not determined by the number of convictions that are done under it. It is about the overall sense of immorality that is preached by the presence of a doctrine that tells you that this is wrong. Now, historically, even if you, when we talk about demedicalizing, depathologizing homosexuality, what is very interesting is the process of medicalization of homosexuality was not done by medical procedures. In the Western system of the medicine, in the early 1900s, gradually when the secular laws were coming into formation, people thought that we should go outside the realm of the church and gradually start building secular chapters in medicine. That was apparently a very progressive step. But out of that progress, what happened is the activities which were considered to be sins now came to be seen as diseases. This transition from being a sin to a disease was not done by any cohort or case control study. So it was not a scientifically documented pathology. It was a simple translation of a sin into religious sin into a medical pathology. And the medical professionals were thrown this domain of sexuality without any formal training to deal with it. Now, the challenge was with the activists to demedicalize it without even knowing what, in the first place, medicalized it. So there was no theory as to why homosexuality is abnormal. It was made abnormal on account of being a sin. And then we are now trying to prove that it is normal. So you will see people using anthropology, genetics, and many other theories to validate homosexuality, which I also feel very problematic. I mean, that's a very bad use of these subjects. heterosexuality in the first place was not validated on the basis of genetics. So no one asked in which locus of the chromosome your heterosexual gene resides and then said it's okay to be heterosexual. So finding a gay gene adds more stigma to the overall perception of homosexuality being a disease than not. Now, also the way we are taught medicine in the colleges is devoid of what should I say of touch of human science. I mean, in humanities, the approach is more divergent. A single topic can have multiple conclusions. Natural sciences tend to be more convergent in its own pedagogical approach. Like if there is an equation and there is an answer to that equation, that answer should be same in USA, same in the United States, same in the United Kingdoms, same in Bangladesh, same in Pakistan, same in India. And although this for a material science and for evidence-based medicine is actually a good practice, but for a social medicine perspective, this is very disastrous. It homogenizes the whole human spectrum and makes them not only into a single species, it makes all of them similar. And the dimensions of similarity are calculated on the basis of majority. That is why the religious sin becomes a disease, the illegal becomes a disease, the immoral becomes a disease, and a whole lot of judgment comes into playing what is physiology and what is pathology. The distinction is clearly not just biological. A lot of social constructs play into that. So now if you ask me how we can make the system, the educational system and the health system more queer affirmative, you can understand so many sectors are involved here. It is not just the medical college. The medical campus is the tip of the iceberg. And the problem is deep rooted into the gender stereotypes and the dynamics, the sexual orientation stigma that we are implanting from the school age. That same person is now becoming a college teacher and is promoting the same kind of virtue or vice that they have been taught. So it's a long process. We started.
I wonder if I can.
Yes,
sorry,
yes,
I wonder
yes.
if I can interrupt. I have just one question before we wrap
Sure.
up with you. So you talked about the mindset that's difficult to change, you said. So even if we change the penal code and things, it's the culture, it's the mindset. So what are your thoughts or your ideas on how we as professionals can change the culture of our workplaces to be more inclusive?
I started by changing the milieu in my own class. So the first time I go to my class, I make them feel in a very quote unquote normalized way that your sexuality or gender identity does not matter in the class. At the same time, they matter in the class. They do not matter because that doesn't give you any privilege or underprivilege, but they matter because you have a right to be who you are, and we will not judge you for that. You will be judged for your performance. You will be judged for your human behavior. You will be judged for your interpersonal interaction, but not for your gender and sexual identity. That is one thing that is actively and passively made very clear in my class. No homophobic bullies are allowed. No homophobic jokes are treated as jokes. And the punishment for such jokes is that you read up queer issues and next day you make a presentation. So the punishment again has to be additive. It should make the person learn. It should not create a negative repercussion. Second thing is I try to incorporate queer issues in my medical chapters in a state-of-the-art manner, not highlighting it. For example, when I'm discussing the uses of estrogen, while discussing estrogen for the treatment of, say, for example, prostatic cancer, another common use will be during the hormone replacement therapy of MTF transition. So that becomes a very common topic and not a highlighted special topic. In a similar way, when I discuss spironolactone, a diuretic, I casually discuss the historical importance of spironolactone for gender transition when estrogen preparations were not available because of its anti-androgenic effect. So they gradually understand that this is a part of the chapter and we are dealing with the human race as a whole. It's not a subject of only heterosexual people. In our college, there has been many developments in the student sector. Students formed a larger community called Doctors for a Cause, and they have a LGBTQ task force. So they make the LGBTQ issues in the campus very visible. They celebrate various days of queer awareness, and they make it very clear that if there is a homophobic or transphobic bully in the college, that will be reported not just as a bully, but also a case of ragging under the same spectrum, and similar kinds of punishments will be done. Similar support groups are being also formed in Archie Kaur Medical College under the name of Azad. The Medical College Calcutta has also declared themselves to be a queer-friendly space. I think these are developments. I think these are things which are small things which will build together and get together towards a more inclusive society.
Thank you so much. So you've told us a little bit about the challenges in the medical profession, especially around people having trained a long time ago and holding on to some of those beliefs and cultures from their time of training, how actually changes in policy or governmental guidance doesn't always trickle down to the culture and the attitudes. And then you've really usefully given us some ideas for how to change cultural mindsets in the medical profession around kind of actively naming gender and sexuality, giving additive feedback, additive corrective feedback and punishments rather than something that's negative or detracting, normalizing conversations about gender, sexuality, and intersex experiences by linking it with other areas of medicine, and also community building. So thank you so much. And so now I'm gonna move on to I think it's Dr. Vandina next. Is that okay, Vandina? Yeah, and I'll ask you the same question. So from the perspective of your profession, which I guess is psychiatry, how can our systems be more supportive of the queer community?
First, I'd like to thank Dr. Tirthankar for putting it so concisely, because I think it's a true reflection of what medical training entails, where there is no clear specification given, and I don't think I could have put it better. And when we move from undergraduate medical training that is like that onto psychiatry training, which is more specific, things actually get more confused, because if you really look at older versions of psychiatry textbooks, or even like look at theories developed by earlier psychologists or psychodynamically oriented therapies, etc., all of them seem to pathologize this. And from there on, newer versions of textbooks have transformed. They take a more neutral stance, I can say, at least the way the DSM has, or our diagnostic criteria have moved. So when you come from undergraduate medical training, which teaches you nothing, onto psychiatry, where there's been confusing versions and different edits, so it becomes all the more confusing, because you've moved from pathologizing it onto taking a neutral stance. But in practice, you don't know how to translate from considering something to be having psychodynamic origins onto not having any problem at all. So it's a difficult transition. I would agree with Dr. Tirthankar again that senior members of the profession have started off with different beliefs. So the transition is difficult, it takes time, and it takes a lot of unlearning. And we have to keep up with the legal system. So overall, I think in a few years we'll be a little further up from here, but right now it's a period of transition. Also, I think in terms of practically what we do, there's of course a stigma. So a lot of queer or trans gender people may not really directly want to approach mental health professionals because of the kind of stigma that's been built around it. And earlier treatments promoted aversion or promoted ways to undo the damage, so to say. So even now, the general perception is that going to a mental health professional is going to lead you on to one of those therapies. So I think we are moving, we're transitioning, but we haven't really understood that right now what's the stance we're supposed to take, and how are we practically going to implement that in welcoming people to approach for therapeutic help or supporting them in the best possible way. And I think this confusion reflects in different set of mental health professionals as well, because our training doesn't include aspects of how to make it all inclusive. It doesn't include how do we take everyone along with us. And whether it's assessment, whether it's therapy, or all of these areas have that confusion, which is still probably ongoing. But I think slowly things are moving. And to answer your question about how we transition from here, I think it'll take a lot of training. It would probably require including people who identify as one of the queer or transgender persons, who can give us lived experiences, tell us what it really meant for them to have this experience. a lot of people will come and tell us about how stigmatizing it was, because just like Dr. Tirthankar mentioned, right at the reception, you'll be addressed by a different pronoun, or when you are filling up a form, you'll not have an option to opt for a gender because you cannot identify with what's on the list. And then when we're doing even a mental health evaluation, there are specific questions which may no longer be accepted, because uh, even in terms of therapeutic approaches, if you're trying to identify why you came to be the way you are, a lot of people may not want that. What they want to understand more is how do they deal with the dysphoria, how do they move forward from here. And so a lot of therapeutic approaches actually try to answer why rather than how we resolve the problem and take it forward from here. And I think that's where we can make a difference.
Thank you. And can I just ask, just before we wrap up with you, we've got a couple of minutes. What from your perspective, what are the impacts of living in this heteronormative or queer insensitive world on people's well-being and mental health?
I think it's multifaceted. It starts very early in life. And I think our other panelists will definitely be talking about impact on education, impact on employment, getting different rights. And all of these have an effect on mental health as well. And I think right from early childhood, acceptance of who they are, trying to identify, trying to create an own identity within all that dysphoria and confusion in itself is a task. That's why we see a much higher rate of mental health concerns in people who do not identify as heteronormative. And therefore, you'll see a higher rate of lifetime anxiety, lifetime depression, and very high rates of suicide compared to probably other groups of people, right? And a lot of it comes from dealing with the dysphoria, trying to get social acceptance, family acceptance, and trying to make sense of what's going on and also make decisions on how to move forward, right? We'll meet people who are in different levels of transition, some who may just be trying to accept, some who might be trying to make decisions around the acceptance. And again, it's a choice. People can choose from a varying range of options. But I think because of the kind of impact that society has, family has, and the kind of opportunities that are lost, there will be a higher level of violence and trauma we will get to see in this age group. I mean, in this category. And there will be probably help seeking in itself is a problem. So that's why the problems vary depending on what stage that we would meet them at. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So, Vandana, you've really kindly spoken to us about, from your perspective as a psychiatrist, how we can make society more inclusive or our services more inclusive for queer people. And you've, echoing what Dr. Tirthankar was saying, you've spoken about the very old models and how confusing it can be because things get updated in theory, but then in practice, maybe it's a bit harder. We're not trained to actually be queer affirmative. It's just something that's kind of said, and that theory practice link is perhaps missing. They also spoke about needing to unlearn, and I wonder if that's like a collective unlearning, but also an individual unlearning that we all need to go through in order to be queer affirmative. And so you pointed out some of the impacts on mental health and well-being. So many things, as you said, multifaceted. So early life experiences, trauma, violence, and the pressure of the social context, the expectations, and also lost opportunities around education, employment, and really importantly for us as mental health professionals, the development of an identity and a sense of self and a sense of belonging, which is so core to our well-being, is really disrupted by the social stigmas and biases surrounding queer experiences. And so you've really helpfully pointed out some of the things that need to be done within the psychiatric profession around more training, more representation, hearing more from the queer community here, whose voices are we not hearing, and also kind of not going back into the why, but moving forward into the how, like how am I going to continue rather than why am I queer. So thank you so much. And so next I'll move to Dr. Anita. And I'll ask you the same question. So from the perspective of your profession, how can our systems be more supportive of the queer community?
Thank you. As a multicultural educator, I often think, as a human race, we have come a long way. We made such great strides in several walks of life, especially in science and technology and medicine. The recent COVID-19 vaccine came out in record time. But then, how does our report card look as a human race when it comes to human relations? We treat some people less than because they are different from how we look. And so that's really sad in terms of the human civilization. And society looks to its educational institutions to fix some of these issues. And so as an educator, as a teacher educator, and who deals with school education or prepares teachers for schools, I see both K-12, kindergarten through 12th grade, and the higher education system, especially with focusing on teacher education. Now, when we look at K-12 schools in India, we have a huge spectrum. You have the government schools, some of them located in remote rural areas, to the elite schools. And what we find is in metros and maybe middle to those elite schools, there are support systems available for the LGBTQIA+. But when you consider India, that is such a minuscule percentage. So most of them are rural based. And that leaves a huge number of schools out of that circle. So most educational institutions, let's begin with the physical environment. So they are not friendly to the transgender community. So with bathrooms that are generally binary, male, female, so it begins there. And when we look at the high school population where students are trying to find out their gender identities, most of them may not come out because they are scared of society. So that's the bulk of the Indian society. Then when it comes to the psychological environment, of course, there are cases of name calling and bullying that are prevalent. And some of the metros are doing much better, but again, there are several other cities which, they're not friendly at all towards this population. And in the school system, as has been discussed already, yes, especially in English, the pronouns are, no one cares to ask which pronoun a student belongs to. So, and that causes confusion. And we must become sensitized to using gender neutral pronouns. So what I still find is the use of he, and sometimes the she students are talking about he even in this day and age. So we need to move to they pretty quickly. In terms of what and I ask myself, what support systems do educational institutions provide to students who identify themselves as LGBTQIA+, and are there centers with trained staff and policies in place, especially in middle school and high schools? In thinking about that, I'll take all of us to the National Education Policy, which came out in 2020, and the strategies to implement it are being worked out. So I want to bring or state what the policy states. While the policy is silent about lesbians and gays and bisexual, it does mention transgender 4 times in the policy. And I'm quoting from the National Education Policy. And it says, while the Indian education system and successive government policies have made steady progress towards bridging gender and social category gaps in all levels of school education, large disparities still remain. So they acknowledge it, especially at the secondary level, particularly for socio-economically disadvantaged groups. So this is the term that NEP uses, socio-economically disadvantaged groups, SEDGs, for all people who are underprivileged, disadvantaged. And what it specifically says that can be broadly categorized on gender identities, particularly female and transgender individuals. So they make a mention of transgender individuals. And it goes on to mention other categories, but I'll just leave it at female and transgender individuals. The point here is the policy recognizes them. Then it goes to state that the government of India will constitute a gender inclusion fund to build the nation's capacity to provide equitable quality education for all girls as well as transgender students. So it's envisioning gender inclusion fund, and the fund will be available to the states to implement priorities determined by the central government, critical for assisting female and transgender children in gaining access to education, such as the provision of sanitation and toilets, bicycles, conditional cash transfers, etc. And finally, funds will also enable states to support and scale effective community-based interventions that address local context specific barriers to female and transgender children's access to and participation in education. So that's a welcoming move by the National Education Policy.
I wonder if I can interrupt you really quickly. So we've got a couple of minutes, and I wanted to make sure that we ask you how we can move from queer-friendly to queer affirmative practices in education.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. In the pre-service teacher program, the Bachelor's of Education program, the introduction of the course Gender, School and Society has been made mandatory by the NCT, which governs us. But my studies from the US multicultural education, where there's been a lot of studies in changing attitudes of pre-service teachers with interventions such as service learning experiences, specific interventions like you use case studies and autobiographies and things like that about diverse groups. It's been a mixed bag of results that we have got. So some are positive, some bring positive attitudinal changes, but some don't. So it's a mixed bag, and the conclusion that has come out as a result of decades of research is one standalone course is not going to make any difference. So therefore, we need concerted efforts, a lot of service learning experiences, not only in the pre-service program, but going forward, even in the in-service program. Teachers do need professional development workshops in order to continue the work in that area. Now, when we look at textbooks, so again, it's not evenly represented. So one of my students did her research project on just looking at the representation of females in the textbooks, and she concluded that as it is, the representation of female is less, and there's no mention of LGBTQ at all in one of the popularly used textbooks in India. So we need to have more examples in textbooks.
I wonder if I can ask you to give us one last point, sorry, before we move on.
Okay, so I would say that there are queer literacy frameworks There are approaches, there are culturally responsive theory and frameworks available that we can begin to use in our teacher education programs and in service programs. There are queer literacy frameworks as well. So we can begin our work here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So you've just, given us a wonderful, comprehensive overview of the issues that are faced in the educational system to be more queer affirmative, and you've spoken about some of the strides that are happening, and yet it feels like we've still got a long way to go. So there's a big focus on gender equality, helping girls and young women, but then and now inclusion of trans people's experiences, but we're still not quite thinking about other people who might be in the queer community, other sexual and gender diversities and intersex people. So there's still things to look to. And I was really struck by what you said, that society looks to education to fix these issues. So that's a huge responsibility. And even the previous panelists have both spoken about, we need to train, we need to educate differently. And so I can see that, there is such a pressure for educational policy and educational staff to be doing things a bit differently. And you've given us some ideas around how they can be trained differently, using existing literature and curricula that exist. And I was really struck by what you were saying about changing staff attitudes and making the educational reports seem to focus a lot on increasing access. But then actually, I think what you were talking about is inclusion. How do we, once people come to school or once people are attending educational institutes, how do we make sure that it's a safe enough space? How do we make sure they stay there and we're not perpetuating violence within the institution? We don't just want them coming through the door and then being bullied, as you said, or harassed in the educational institute. Thank you. So I'm going to move now to Ms. Somabha. Are you able to hear me? Yes, great. So let me ask you, so from the perspective of your profession, how can our systems be more supportive of the queer community?
Well, to begin with, being from an entirely different field, unlike the panelists here. So, the law field includes a lot of stakeholders. It includes the advocates who are pleading before the courts of law. It includes those individuals before whom the advocates actually plead, the judges, the judicial system, which includes both the lower judiciary as well as the higher judiciary. And third, of course, would be those individuals who are in the administration, in the justice delivery administration, including and primarily criminal justice administration, which has the police and others who are involved into it, let's say medical professionals or the ones who are dealing with forensic and all of that. So which actually means that modification would be not just into the law, but also in all these different stakeholders concerned. So to begin with, the law as such has actually modified itself, at least to some extent, with the new law that is in place, which is the Act of 2019. However, that act is specific to the transgender persons, inclusive of course, the socio-cultural identities, which have been mentioned under the definitional clause itself of the Act, Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019. Along with that, it has also included within the definition intersex individuals as well. However, that's a different dynamics altogether as to whether that has to be criticized or it has to be appreciated. I'm not going into that because that's a different discussion altogether. So that is the law part of it when we deal with some kind of a legislation in place. That's one. The other one is with regard to the judge-made laws, as we say in academia. That includes what happened with the Nalsa verdict, what in 2014, what happened with the Navdeep Johar decision in 2018, and there have been multiple petitions before various high courts on very many other issues. But primarily these two case laws are the ones which are the judge-made laws, which actually are the laws of the country. There in the 2018 decision, the Navteej Johar versus Union of India, in that one we see the mention of not the entire LGBTQIA community, which is not just specific to the transgender individuals. Now, as we know that there's a huge difference between the LGBTQIA individuals and, or rather, the LGBTQIA spectrum, and each letter has a huge role to play. I think that is where it begins. So, we have the Act of 2019 specifically for the transgender persons, and these two case laws which are in place for the LGBTQIA community as such, in general, in India. So that's why I began by saying that the law has modified itself. So it is just the law which has modified itself. But as I said, that the different stakeholders, there's a long way to go. Because starting from the ones who are going to, let's say, issue that certificate, which will help the transgender persons, for example, to change their identity, or rather the names in the identity cards and all of that, that individual has to be trained. That has not happened to a lot extent. It has happened in pockets of the country, but not really throughout. So there is, even though there's this uniform law or uniform guideline, that has not happened in a very systematic manner across the country. So that has to be modified, and that modification begins with the awareness of the two decisions, as well as the plenty of other decisions from the high courts and the Act of 2019. Similarly, when it transcends to the police personnel, there's a huge lack of awareness and sensitization as to the LGBTQIA community. Leave aside going in depth of what each of these letters actually mean. So even though virtually section 377 of the Indian Penal Code has been decriminalized, there are situations of harassment which actually still happen. So there's a difference between criminalizing and there's a difference between harassing you because there's a provision that existed at one point in time. So here in this situation, even though we cannot now be charged for the act which is defined under section 377, the police still tends to harass the individuals. So as we can see that there is a dilemma constant and there are issues. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, sorry, we lost you briefly, but I think you were talking about the fact that it's not sufficient just for the law to change, but actually the practices need to change, and especially the police force are still harassing and kind of
Yes,
doing things not in line with the law.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So presently there's a petition which is the petition before pending before the Supreme Court. It is the Ripak Council versus Union of India petition, which argues and seeks for gender neutrality of the laws, especially the criminal laws, which means it argues for recognition and or rather legally recognizing transgender rape of the individuals identifying as lesbian or gay or bisexual, because the conception that rape is just not a man committing a rape on a woman, that has not yet changed. Even though the Justice Verma Committee report in 2013, post which the entire criminal laws system and all the criminal laws underwent a huge difference and a modification, in that report, Justice Verma Committee report, it is mentioned that transgender rape is a reality in India. Yet we do not find that either in the Act of 2019 or in any other. So that has not been in the Act of 2019. Neither has it been mentioned in any other policy papers or anywhere else.
I'm going to interrupt you just for 1 second. We're struggling a little bit with your sound. I wonder if I can ask you to have your camera off.
Should I
in
switch
case
off
that will
camera
help.
and try? Yes. I think this is better. So
yeah, could you repeat just the last point you made? We're just coming up to time, so if you could repeat
Yes.
the last point you made.
Yes. So the point I made with regard to how Justice Verma Committee report had mentioned in 2013 that transgender is a reality here. Still audible?
I think we're struggling. So if it's okay, I'll try and summarize, and then we'll move on to the question and answer section. So we've just heard from Shomaba about the legal system and how the legal system can be a bit more queer affirmative and some of the challenges that we're facing. And so they spoke about the fact that there's so many stakeholders involved, and actually there's two different things. There's legislation and there's case law, and both of these things might not say the same thing, or they might be in agreement, but actually the practices in all those stakeholder groups might be quite different. And especially they focused on speaking about the police and how police officers might be enacting things that don't necessarily sit within legislation or case law, but it's still happening. So the violence is still happening and being perpetuated even when the law has already changed. It makes me think about what Dr. Anita was speaking about, that, or even Vandana, this gap between theory and practice. So the law says one thing, but the police are doing something a bit different, and they hold a lot of power in our system. So who gets to challenge the police? Who gets to challenge the person who is enacting the power and the violence? And so that brings us just up to the last 8 to 10 minutes, and we were hoping to take some questions from the audience. Now I don't understand the tech for this, so I don't know how that's going to work. I wonder if Ananya is going to help us out with that.
Yeah. So Navya, there is a comment by one of the audience members. So Surbi has said, re-evaluating and clarifying the linguistics associated with the non-binary may empower restricted or unvoiced expressions. Traditional restraints are strengthened through outdated linguistic norms. So I would ask if any of our panelists would want to share their views and opinions.
Yeah, thank you, Subhi, for the comment. Yes, I totally agree with you that we need to sensitize our students, both in K-12 and our teachers, about using the correct language. When I say correct, I know it's a very subjective term. What I mean is the gender inclusive, gender fluid, gender non-binary terminology. So yeah, as TherapHeal has also responded, yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, Surbi. And I see Ashlyn has also written.
It's a beautiful question. Do you mind if I read it out loud? So Ashlyn is asking, what are some of the ways people can be urged to take ownership of educating or sensitizing themselves to these problematic depictions without expecting spoon feeding in this regard? What are some of your thoughts?
May I answer this?
Please
One
go
of
ahead.
the ways I think this can be done is by changing organizational policy, particularly an organization where you are either training or you are being paid for your services. So actually, it works that way. It sounds very crude, but it really works that way. If your organization sets out very strict policies for violating gender identities, misgendering people, using homophobic and transphobic bullies, then automatically the punishment protocol will negatively sensitize someone. There can also be rewards, I mean, positive reinforcement in the form of queer allies being formed in the campus or in the workplace. So I think because designation, promotion, at the end of the day, salary and educational attributions do matter. So people will use this material baits for maybe a spiritual upliftment. That can be one way of actually making people learn. It's almost like the kind of punishment that I give, that if you have to attend the next class, you learn do a 10-minute presentation on the mistakes you have made in the previous class, and then you enter gracefully into class. It's as simple as that.
I just received one question on my WhatsApp for somebody who was watching it live, and this is for us, for the mental health professionals. And the person asked, like, how much do we feel we are equipped, and how much are we sensitized, and what are we as mental health professionals doing, or what should we do to make us more sensitized towards the LGBTQIA issues?
Vandana, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll answer this one. And I think it's a learning in process. As I said, the transition is ongoing, and therefore I think we also have to equip ourselves with what might be best suited, ways in which we can make inclusivity a part of our practice. And I, for one, believe that listening to lived experiences, making changes to our practice based on feedback that we get is a really good way of continuity of learning, because as I think it's come up multiple times from multiple panelists, the theory really doesn't convert to practice. But what can really improve our practice is hearing what people have to say, making someone feel included, irrespective of their gender, sexuality, identity, is making them feel comfortable to open up, to understand, and to be able to share and feel heard. And for that, I think it's really important to have an open mind and be able to take feedback and work on feedback. And I think this is probably the way forward, irrespective of what kind of professionals we are.
And I guess I'm happy to jump in really quickly. So one of the things that I think is really important for me as a person, and I wonder about us as a profession, and not just mental health professionals. I think everyone in this panel has spoken about the need to challenge our own pre-existing biases and the things that we're socialized into, right? And I think there's a real strong narrative that people who say the wrong thing or the insensitive thing or do something ignorant are bad or evil people. And I think that kind of splitting is really unhelpful. And actually, if we can acknowledge that we're all on this journey and somehow retain a bit of compassion for being in that process, and also staying accountable to ourselves, to each other, and to the queer community, to do the unlearning and to do all the work internally. And I guess that requires that kind of more factual knowledge, kind of hearing from the lived experiences of the community or learning more about experiences that people might face, and also sitting with our own discomfort of privilege and what does that feel like, and actually when do we get defensive and when do we act out of our defensive position, and when are we causing harm. And I wonder, as a profession or as people, we're just not very good at doing that. We're not very good at sitting with our privilege and noticing and naming our own biases in ways that, and the ways that we're enacting harm. And I wonder, as a collective, all these people here today across different fields, feels like we're moving in that direction, that we're all sitting here talking openly about our lived experiences and our privileges in different contexts and how that's going to impact the queer community.
There is one more question, if we have some time, maybe.
Yeah.
So I just like to go forward. I just like to go forward with the question. So the question that was posted by the audience: what is the meaning of adding she or her in the introductory part? Would anyone like to answer or take that up?
There's a couple of us who have it, so do you want to go first?
Yeah, like I can try to answer. I mean, this is a depiction of your preferred gender pronoun. It tells you what kind of pronoun I should use while addressing you. Now, you might think that it is superfluous as to why a biological female will use she and her in the brackets. I'm just asking, I'm not assuming that you are actually thinking in this way, but many people can. So it's just normalizing this whole act of not presuming one's gender. So even if I am looking like a male, it is customary that I put he or him in brackets if I wish to be called with the pronouns he or him. So it is not the, actually it's not a burden for people who are non-gender conformative or transgender to mention their preferred pronouns. Preferred pronouns should be mentioned by everyone, because you do not know as to in which end of the spectrum they really identify, and because gender is also not like two sides of a coin. So sometimes the preferred pronouns can also apparently look very non-grammatical, like it can also be she and them. So it's always good to mention them to avoid misgendering someone.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think we've come up to the end of our time. And I'm sure there will be more questions that we haven't had a chance to answer, and we're going to keep track of them. And I think we'll find other ways of answering the questions. We're planning some more things, but Majanai, as part of the LGBTQIA plus the project that we're running. So please do keep questions coming, and we'll be sure to save them and answer them at a later date. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. It has been incredible having you here, and really meaningful to have this discussion across so many disciplines. And I think I'm feeling quite angry that we're all saying the same thing, like the theory practice links, and the policy needs changing, and we need people to unlearn. And I think anger is a good thing. It kind of brings the energy up and energizes us to create change. So thank you so much for participating with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.